You wake at 3 in the morning to voices no one else can hear. Today, you might text a therapist, swallow a small pill, and try to fall back asleep. 3,000 years ago, someone would have drilled a hole in your skull to let the demon out. Same fear, same desperate wish to make it stop. Only the tools have changed. So did ancient humans care for their most fragile minds or cast them out? The answer hides an instinct that is still alive, right now, quietly inside you. That instinct has a very old signature, and you can still read it, carved into human bone. Picture a skull, thousands of years old, with a neat round hole bored straight through it. Not a wound from a spear, not the bite of some animal. A hole someone made on purpose, with a sharpened stone, while the person was very much alive. They called the reason simple. A demon had crawled inside the head, and the fix was to give it a door. Bad headaches? A demon. Voices at night? A demon. Acting strange? Saying things nobody understood? Same answer, every time. So they drilled, and they prayed, and they hoped whatever was trapped in there would finally leave. Here is where it stops being a horror story and starts being genuinely strange. We have found these skulls on nearly every continent, and many of them show something remarkable. New bone growing back around the edges of the hole. That regrowth means the patient lived. They survived the operation and healed. Think about that for a moment. Someone with no real medicine, no idea what infection even was, opened up a living human skull, and the person got up and kept on living. And this practice, drilling into the skull to release the madness, shows up again and again. In cultures separated by whole oceans, people who never met, never traded, never shared a single word, all landing on the same idea. So before you decide those people were primitive, sit with this for a second. When something inside your own mind frightens you, when a thought loops at 2 in the morning and will not stop, what is the very first thing you want? You want it gone, out, removed. You would not reach for a stone, of course. You reach for a pill, a scroll, a drink, a distraction. But the impulse underneath is older than language itself. The tool has changed 100 times. The instinct to drill the demon out of you has barely changed at all. But drilling a hole assumes you already know the enemy is inside you. What happens when a whole civilization decides the enemy is somewhere else entirely, watching you, keeping score? Travel to ancient Babylon, and suffering stops being a medical event and becomes a spiritual invoice. If your mind turned dark, if you could not sleep, if fear pinned you to the floor, the explanation was chillingly personal. A god was angry with you. You had broken some sacred rule, insulted a temple, skipped an offering, and now a divine hand was pressing down on your life. And honestly, if you have ever had a panic attack, that phrase, something pressing down on me, lands a little too close for comfort. So they built an entire profession around the problem. Priests called Ashipu worked like spiritual detectives. Their job was to figure out exactly which god you had offended and how badly. They studied your symptoms, your dreams, your behavior, then cross-referenced all of it against long clay tablets, page after page of divine offenses, and their matching punishments. It was, in a strange way, one of the first diagnostic manuals ever written. Here's the part that should stop you. When we read those tablets today, we recognize what they were describing. The racing thoughts, the crushing lows, the voices, the sleepless dread. What we now call depression, mania, and psychosis. We're all sitting right there, carefully observed, thousands of years ago. They saw the illness clearly. They just aimed the blame at the sky. And before you feel too far removed from them, ask yourself what you actually do with your own bad days. You hunt for the culprit. It was the hormones. It was your childhood. It was the stars, the season, the bad energy in the room. The name of the god keeps changing, but the instinct underneath, that need to pin your inner pain on something outside you, is pure Babylon, and it is still running quietly inside you. So far, every answer has pointed away, from the suffering person, out toward demons, up toward angry gods. But drift down the Nile, and you meet the first people, who did something almost shocking. They looked at a troubled mind and reached for medicine instead of blame. The Egyptians did not treat a breakdown as a punishment. They treated it as a condition, something in the body that had slipped out of balance and could be gently coaxed back. And their prescriptions sound less like an ancient horror story and more like a wellness retreat you would happily pay for today. Rest, herbs, music, time spent in calm, green surroundings, conversation, sleep. There was even a kind of therapy built around dreams. At temples devoted to the healing figure Imhotep, a distressed person could come, lie down in a quiet, sacred space, and sleep through the night, while priests watched over them. In the morning, their dreams would be read like a map, gently pointing toward whatever the troubled heart needed. We would later give this a clinical name, but strip away the language, and it is startlingly humane. A frightened person, safe, resting, and finally listened to. And we are not guessing at any of this. We can read it. Medical writings that survive from that world, thousands of years old, describe emotional suffering in careful, practical terms and reach for remedies rather than exorcisms. Some of their writings even describe a heart that feels too full or too empty, an early, fumbling attempt to name the highs and lows we now call mood. They got plenty wrong about the body, but the instinct behind the care was tender, in a way that still feels rare. When your own mind is fraying at the edges, what do you actually reach for? A garden or a glowing screen? Thousands of years ago, someone in pain was handed rest, sunlight, and a person who would simply listen. And some nights, that still sounds like exactly the thing you are missing. Egypt handed suffering a garden, but cross the sea to ancient Greece, and something new happens. For the first time, people stop agreeing on what madness even is, and they go to war over the answer. Not with swords, with ideas. And that argument would echo for the next 2,000 years. On one side stood the dreamers, and their most famous voice was Plato. To them, a mind that broke from ordinary reality was not damaged, it was chosen. Plato described several kinds of divine madness, states of prophecy, of poetry, of overwhelming love, and he ranked them above cold, everyday logic. In his view, the person hearing things no one else could hear might not be sick at all. They might be touched by something higher, carrying truths the rest of us were too ordinary to receive. Madness, to this camp, could be a gift. On the other side stood a doctor named Hippocrates, and he was having none of it. He looked at the same trembling, frightened, struggling people and said, plainly, "This is not the gods, this is the body." He argued that the mind lived in the brain and that when it suffered, the cause was physical, a substance out of balance inside you. In fact, one of those imagined substances was a dark fluid they called black bile, and the word they built from it, melancholy, is still the word you reach for on your heaviest days. He was wrong about the details. But sit with what he was really saying. Your despair is not a curse. It is a condition. It has a cause you can study, and maybe, one day, treat. And here's why that matters. We would spend almost 2,000 more years wandering away from that simple idea before the modern world finally circled back to it. Hippocrates was standing at the finish line, waving, while the rest of history took the long way around. But notice something. You still live inside that ancient argument. Part of you wants to believe in the tortured artist, the haunted genius, the idea that pain is secretly meaningful and rare. And part of you, at 3 a.m, just wants a name for it, and something that makes it stop. Divine gift or medical condition. 2 camps, still fighting. And the battlefield, quietly, is you. Rome did what Rome always did. It took the best of Greek thinking, kept some of it, ruined some of it, and built better roads along the way. On the good days, that inheritance was genuinely kind. A physician named Galen carried the medical torch forward. He treated troubled minds with warm baths, exercise, changes in diet, and something quietly radical, conversation. He believed the stories. A suffering person told about their own pain actually mattered, that talking it through was part of the cure. It is not quite therapy as you know it, but you can already see the shape of it, forming in the distance. But here is where the story turns cold. Rome also handed us one of the darkest tools in this entire history, and it did not come from a doctor. It came from a courtroom. Roman law had a category. For a person judged to have lost their mind, once that label was fixed to you, your rights simply vanished. You could be locked away. Your property was handed to a guardian. And the person who decided whether you qualified was not a physician at all. It was your own family and a local official. Now sit with what that opens up. If a relative was genuinely, deeply unwell, yes, they might be protected. But if a relative was simply inconvenient, embarrassing, or standing between someone and a fortune, well, the word for madness gets awfully flexible when there is an inheritance on the table. And that trapdoor never fully closed. Think about how easily, even now, the word crazy gets aimed at people. The ex who is suddenly unstable. The whistleblower who is clearly unhinged. The relative nobody wants to sit next to. Sometimes it is true, and sometimes it is just the quietest way to erase a person so you never have to hear what they are actually saying. It is the cleanest way to win an argument without ever answering it. That temptation is Roman, and it still lives close to you. Here is where the usual story gets lazy. We are told the centuries after Rome were nothing but darkness, superstition, and priests waving away demons. And in much of Europe, that was painfully true. But it is only half the map. Because while one part of the world was performing exorcisms, another part was quietly building hospitals. Travel east, across the medieval Islamic world, and you find something that should genuinely stop you. A brilliant physician, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote a medical encyclopedia so complete, it would shape doctors for centuries. And when he wrote about the mind, he did not reach for demons. He described conditions you would recognize instantly today: deep depression, crushing anxiety, the loops of an obsessive thought that will not let go. Then he prescribed things that sound almost modern: music, movement, meaningful work, and careful conversation, designed to gently shift how a person thinks and feels. Sit with the date for a second. We are talking about psychological treatment, described more than 1,000 years ago. Not in some recent enlightened age. Centuries before the modern therapist, before the modern clinic, before the word psychology even existed, you were told this was a European breakthrough, a gift of the modern age. It was neither. And they did not just write about it, they built for it. In cities like Baghdad and Cairo, some of the earliest hospitals in human history set aside space for the mentally unwell. These were not prisons. Records describe places with running water, gardens, gentle sound, and physicians keeping watch. Actual healing spaces. Meanwhile, a long ride to the west, someone was still being tied down, while a demon was ordered to leave. So the next time you assume that kindness is a modern invention, that compassion is something we finally figured out, remember this. It was here. It was written down. It was built in stone, with fountains running through it. And then, for a long stretch of history, much of the world forgot. The knowledge existed. What kept disappearing, again and again, was the will to use it. And that pattern is one you should keep an eye on. But knowledge on a page can be forgotten. What is much harder to erase is a habit a whole town refuses to give up. And in one small corner of Europe, that is exactly what happened. Picture a quiet town called Geel. Starting back in the 13th century, people who were suffering in their minds began arriving there as pilgrims, hoping to be healed. And the townspeople did something that, even now, sounds almost impossible. They took them in, not into a cell, not into a locked ward, into their own homes. Strangers with troubled minds. Sat at the family table, slept under the family roof, worked in the fields beside everyone else, and were simply folded into ordinary daily life. Nobody called it treatment. Nobody wrote a grand theory about it. They just decided these were people, and people belongs somewhere. And here is the detail. That should give you chills. This did not last a year or a single generation. It has continued in that same town for roughly 700 years. It is still happening today. 700 years of ordinary neighbors doing quietly what emperors, priests, and physicians never managed to do. Think about that. Against everything we have seen. No drilling, no chains, no angry gods, no courtroom stripping away a life. Just families quietly choosing, century after century, to make room for the people everyone else had given up on. If a modern reformer stood up tomorrow and proposed this exact idea, folding the mentally ill into everyday homes and everyday work, they would be hailed as a visionary. The people of Geel were already doing it, before your country existed. And notice what it actually required. Not a medical degree, not a miracle drug, not a single piece of technology you carry in your pocket right now. It required one stubborn belief, repeated across generations, that a suffering person is still a person and still belongs. That belief was always available. It always is. It cost them nothing but the courage to look at someone frightening and choose to stay anyway. The only real question, then and now, is whether you are willing to hold it. Now hold that warm picture of Geel in your mind, because we are about to walk into the exact opposite, and the contrast is going to sting. At the very same stretch of history, in the heart of London, people were not opening their homes to the suffering. They were selling tickets to look at them. There was a hospital there. Its real name, long and formal, but everyone knew it by its nickname, Bedlam. And that word has survived, all the way into your own vocabulary. When you call a chaotic scene Bedlam, you are quoting this place. You do not get your name turned into a synonym for screaming disorder, unless something truly went wrong inside your walls. For a stretch of time, this was simply a normal day out, as ordinary as a trip to see the animals. Here is the part that is hard to sit with. On certain days, the public could pay a small fee, walk through the wards, and simply watch. The patients, at their most frightened, their most unwell, their most broken, became a show. Families made a day of it. They came, they pointed, they laughed, they went home. Records suggest thousands of visitors poured through every year, treating human suffering as an afternoon of cheap entertainment. Let that really land. Not torture for information, not punishment for a crime. Entertainment. To stand in front of a person in genuine agony and feel nothing but amusement. A whole society had to quietly agree that these were not quite people anymore. That is the quiet, chilling trick of it. Cruelty rarely feels like cruelty from the inside. It just feels like a normal afternoon. And before you decide, you would never be part of that crowd. Be honest with yourself. How many times have you slowed down to watch a stranger fall apart online? The viral clip. A real person's worst moment passed around as entertainment. The comments treating their pain like a show. The doors of Bedlam never truly closed. We just carry them in our pockets now, and the ticket is free. The only question is whether you still pay it. After centuries of chains, exorcisms, and paid spectacle, you would think the turning point arrived with some grand discovery. It did not. It arrived when a handful of people finally did the most obvious thing imaginable. They looked at suffering human beings and decided to treat them like human beings. In France, near the end of the 1700s, a doctor named Philippe Pinel is remembered for a radical act. He ordered the chains struck off, the patients in his care. In the year 1793, that was considered dangerous, almost insane. Across the water in England, a reformer named William Tuke opened a quiet place he called a retreat, built on a single stubborn premise. No chains, no dungeons, just fresh air, honest work, kindness, and respect. And here is the twist. That should not surprise you anymore. It worked. When people were treated gently instead of tortured, they recovered more often. Compassion was not soft. It was effective. This was hailed as a breakthrough, which is really a polite way of saying the world had to rediscover that being kind to frightened people actually helps them. But do not mistake this for a happy ending, because the very next century, took those good intentions and built enormous asylums, then packed them far beyond capacity until many became warehouses of neglect. The very buildings meant to rescue people slowly turned into new kinds of nightmares, crowded, understaffed, and forgotten. At the same time, real science was finally taking shape. The first serious attempts to study the brain, to name and truly understand these conditions. And that is the strange, aching pattern. Underneath this entire story, the knowledge kept racing ahead. The humanity kept lagging behind, always having to be argued for, fought for, and proven all over again. Progress, it turns out, has never once been a straight line. It is a fight that each new generation has to pick up from the start, which brings it, at last, all the way back to you. You live in the most informed moment in all of human history about the mind. So the real question was never truly about knowledge. Every era had some version of that. The question that actually decides everything is quieter and much harder. It is not what you know about the suffering. It is what, deep down, you believe they deserve. So, did ancient humans care for the mentally ill? The honest answer is both. They drilled and they blamed. They also planted gardens and opened their homes. What changed was never the knowledge. It was the heart behind it. And that same choice sits with you every single time you meet a mind that frightens you. Here is the quiet truth. The hardest thing was never understanding suffering. It was looking at a struggling person and still saying, "You belong here. And if any of this feels too close tonight, please talk to someone you trust." If sitting with that shifted something in you, stay a little longer. Because the strangest instincts you carry today were all shaped back there in the deep human past. Turns out you are far less modern than you think. And honestly, that is the fun part.